Hey everybody, it's All for His Glory Alone, also known as the Bible Answer Dog, and I'm here with Matt Yester and Vincent Lasson. Is that how you say it?
Pretty much, yep. So, I got a quick discussion topic. Had a
Cool.
got an interesting spat with the power happy admins on Reform Pub. Oh man,
Okay.
what is y'all's view on the Second Commandment? Like any picture they think any picture that you put up there pretty much is a violation of the Second Commandment. And
Okay. Well, since I already know my opinion,
people are losing their salvation because of this. I don't know. They overreact like you've never
right?
seen when somebody puts a picture up. What's y'all's thought on the Second Commandment?
Well, Matt, I'll hit
And
it
how
first.
does it apply to pictures online, really?
I'll hit it first, Matt, and then I'll hand it off to you. My view on it is Dr. Robert Morey talked about this when I used to go to his church, and during the Reformation, one of the first things they did is they went in and destroyed all the statues and things, and he always said they should have put it in an art museum, instead of destroying it. Here's the thing. If you're talking about, it depends on how you're coming at it, Vincent. If you're talking about making paintings and statues of like animals and trees and people and things like that, that's not what the second commandment's talking about. It's talking about idolatry. It's talking about making an engraven image of beasts or people or whatever
Yeah.
in order to worship it. Matt, did you have an opinion?
Took the words right out of my mouth. That's my position on it. It's the full commandment there is, not like any images, because I mean, you run into a problem even in the Old Testament there when, well, the ark had images of the cherubim carved in. You had the serpent on the pole. I mean, if you really took the strictest form of that commandment, or the first half of it, then that'd be
Yeah.
violations of that commandment. So you got to read it, the fullness of it there, and it's in purposes of worshiping, bowing down before them, idolatry. Yeah.
I agree completely. It's like, and they had never seemed to take the full verse in a, they only, what I did, I posted a picture of the Freemason Bible I got at the dollar thrift store. It has on the front cover. It has a picture or some Renaissance painting of Jesus teaching in the synagogue when I was a kid. So that's what kind of freaked them out. It's definitely always they seem to limit it only to pictures of Jesus or God. So
Well, okay.
I mean, if you actually read the commandment, that it doesn't seem to line up with why are they only on this instead of
Go ahead. There is
because there's a lot of idolatry going on outside of that. I don't get the inconsistency, I guess, from in their view.
right. The main intent of the second commandment is idolatry, but I will say this: there is a distinction for the Godhead, even though they are all the same nature and the same attributes. There are three persons. Jesus, when he was incarnated, was made in the likeness of men, and that is an actual image that he had. The Father and the Holy Spirit don't have an image. They are invisible. They are spirit. They're not physical. And so, therefore, in church history, it was frowned upon to make any kind of representation of the Father or the Spirit because they don't have form and it's a false representation. So, in that sense, I would agree with them partially. I don't think you should make pictures of the Father or the Spirit because they don't have an image. They don't have a physical presence. Jesus does, and Jesus took on human flesh, and he forever remains in that human flesh. And when we get to heaven, that's how we're going to see God. We're only going to see Christ. We're not going to the Father and the Spirit because they don't have physical form. So pictures of Jesus is fine. I would say pictures of the Father and the Holy Spirit, I would frown upon that too. But I don't know if that's a directly linked to the second commandment. The second commandment's talking about.
I don't know if you actually read the commandment. It's talking about, yeah, well, definitely idolatry, about worshiping these graven images.
Yeah. The distinction I would make. I would say it's not wise or smart. I wouldn't do it myself to make images of the Father. Patient.
Yeah.
Yeah, your mic's open.
Totally agree. Yeah, I think it just unclicked. Sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay. It sounded like you were being, like somebody was strangling you there for a second. Send help to Matt.
I'm doing many workouts, or sets in between while you guys are talking, stuff like that. So I get some sets done. Just chip in. What's up, done with
It's getting up to go to the refrigerator. That's my exercise.
Could have been that too, but yeah, I haven't done that too, bro. Yeah.
Hey Nate, how are you doing?
Yeah, good stuff, guys.
Doing good. Can you hear me?
What's going on? Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, so I'm doing good. I'm just sort of listening more than talking. What's the topic?
You. We were talking about you. No, Vincent asked a question about the second commandment and what our view was on that, and we were covering that.
Yeah. So it's here it is. It's Exodus 20.
Hey, James,
Exodus 20, chapter 4.
you wanna
Nate, hold on. Vincent's talking. Hold on.
I was just going to read it real fast. This, you shall not make for yourself an idol. All right, that's part of an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on the earth below, earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. So you shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting iniquities on the fathers on the children, and on the third and fourth generation of those who hate me.
Now, see, Vincent, what people do is they lack what's called critical reading skills. They don't understand that when there's a especially when it's in English, when there's a comma and there's information added, they don't see it as an explanation of the first. What it's saying is, do not make engraven images, or do not make idols, and then it says, what kind of idols? Of images of things in the water, crawl on the earth, man, whatever. It's not saying don't make idols and don't make images of birds and stuff. It's saying the birds and the man is what the idols look like. They just don't read it correctly. They think it's both. They're saying, well, you can't make idols and you also can't make it any kind of images. And
I know. At that point, you don't have any art at all. You just nobody. Anytime I draw, that's
or photographs.
Yeah, I forget taking photos.
I'm going to open up the comment thing in the browser, and so that we don't overtalk each other, Nate or anybody else. Just type in the comment section that you want to say something, and then I'll turn it to you. That way, we don't.
Hey, I want to say something real quick. I actually have a friend here who wants to say something.
You are listening to Bob Morey Live out of KKLA.
Hey, Dr. Bob.
Hey, how you doing, James? You're back at work.
Yeah.
Rightly dividing the word.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to have to find a program to edit this and put it up as a video. But right now, we do have some viewers, so at least people are hearing it. So it's good to hear from you, Dr. Bob.
All right. And you were discussing the 10 Commandments?
Really, second commandment, because you post any kind of picture online and you get a lot of, you're a second commandment violation. What's your thoughts on the second commandment? Specifically, I'm in groups that you post anything, say like, I posted one where it was a Renaissance picture of Jesus as a child and teaching in the synagogue, and they kind of blew up on that.
These are typical Western European brainwashed Gentile bubalos who don't understand Torah, don't understand. I have a new book of 150 pages in it. And there's a large section where I'm showing people the 10 commandments in Exodus are different from the 10 commandments in Deuteronomy. Now, the reason there's two different versions is because what Moses came down, there were two separate tablets. So all the arguments, do we do 5 and 5 or 4 and 6? That's all pure Gentile nonsense. One tablet was for God as the suzerain king, and the other tablet was for Israel as the conquered vassal slave. So it's two tablets, and they were called the 10 words because they were just brief statements. For example, you shall not covet. Bang, that's all it said. Then Moses would add his exposition of each one. He says, all right, what can you covet? This and that and that and this. Or the keep the Sabbath holy, period. That's all that was on that line, nothing else. And that's why in Exodus, Moses appealed to the creation story, but in Deuteronomy, he drops that and appeals to the Exodus story. And that's why they can add and take away, because when he did the Sabbath command, for example, Moses said, well, I'll illustrate it. You're not supposed to work, or your wife, or that. But he did not mention specifically oxen, a few other things. 40 years later, when Moshe is re-giving the law to people who never heard it and really didn't care, they weren't even circumcised. Their parents knew that their bones would be bleached in the desert. They were never believers anyway. And then he says, and then he lists the animals that were not listed in Exodus, because the Jews would say, now wait a second. He didn't mention that we couldn't work this specific animal. So they were all running around working that animal. Moses was closing the loopholes. And when you come to the second commandments, it is just, again, a few words that would fit on one tablet, one line, and it's very short in the Hebrew. Make no idols, period. Now, you'd have to illustrate, and Moses racked his head thinking, growing up in Egypt and looking at all the gods and goddesses depicted on the walls and stuff like that. Well, okay, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't worship them, certainly. So Moses's commentary is not part of what came down the mountain. And what you have to understand, the application of that, number one, was not against art. Being a friend of Francis Schaeffer, being at L'Abri, his book, Art and the Bible. Have you guys read that book? It's a small book, Art and the Bible.
No, I haven't read it.
Well, you'll find a discussion of art in a couple of my books. And I taught the history of art at a course for University of Pennsylvania. Now, the Bible is not against art, tattoos, jewelry, per se. When it would say no earrings, in that context, it meant earrings with little idols. Like you see these Chinese women with a Buddha earring, or like tattoos you see a Mexican with Our Lady of Fatima tattooed on his back, or the Virgin of Guadalupe. It's not a reference to the art. If you put a butterfly on your ass with the tattoo, you have not violated that rule. The same thing, a wedding ring. I pastored first among the Amish and the Mennonites. They don't even allow them to wear a wedding ring. And they were called the Black Bumper Mennonite. Ever hear of them?
No.
And what's the other guy's name?
Oh, we got Matt here, and we got Vincent. Vincent's the one with the picture of him. Matt's the one with the dog.
Okay.
Just so you know, you are live.
Oh,
So
okay.
a lot of people can hear you on the internet.
Yeah, I had to straighten out what were the commandments, that they were part of a Susanry covenant. And you need to read Meredith Kline, one of my professors at Westminster, on that, and then go back to where he got it from Gerhard von Rad and others. And then pointing out Moses's commentary was added in Scripture as he illustrated how that would work. And that because we come, a couple of thousand years later, it's like thinking the Schofield footnotes are inspired. And you do find some people like that. So once you strip away, and I show you how they do it, for example, if you go to the New Testament, when they quote the commands, they only quote the short statement. That's all they do. They don't give you all of Moses's commentary. It's like the eating of lobster and shrimp and pig. In its context, those were animals used in worship in pagan altars and temples. And I list the names for the pig gods that were in Egypt and Greece. So they worship the swine. So how are you going to keep the Jews from going to worship the pig? Well, you're telling me can't eat anything of it, not even a rib bone, no pork chop, no crackless skin. Now, many years later, you come to the 1st century, those kinds of pagan religions that worship lobster and shrimp and pig, they're all gone. So the reason why the kosher laws were given to avoid entanglement with idolatry had been forgotten, and now all they knew, can't eat pork. Why not? Can't eat it. Why not? Can't eat it. And the legalists today, not knowing historically that they were barriers against pagan worship, they want to continue. Can't eat rabbit, can't eat pork, can't have shrimp, can't have this, stuff like that. So when you come to the 2nd command, whatever it's talking about has nothing to do with art. God himself designed in the tabernacle pictures of palm trees, and even the cherubim themselves were to be rendered. So it's not against art per se, it's against idol worship. You shall not worship them. So art as art is fine. It refers to the image of God within man, said Schaeffer. It's one of the ways we're different from the animal. We make and appreciate art. Of course, someone said, oh yeah, I've seen an elephant brushing stroke. Now, the elephant was taught. In the wild, they don't do portraits. And you see, there's where they're learning to mimic something. But art per se is fine. Now, have you heard of Hans Ruckmacher?
No.
Nope.
He ran the Holland Library, and my wife and I stayed with him as well. He was the head of the Department of the History of Art for the University of Amsterdam. And he wrote 2 wonderful books. And when he came to the United States, I had the privilege of driving him around as a Library person. And I took him to Westminster to give a lecture on the history of art. And there was some prudes there. He started showing slides, and these were statues where the penis had not been knocked off by that pope. I have the name of the pope, and he ran around knocking all the penises off. And the next pope, I give you his name. They glued leaf, the fig leaf on top of it. Well, it caused an uproar. Is Hans Ruckmacher dealing with pornography because he showed male and female nudity? Well, no. So D. James Kennedy called me and asked what I could do to help. I said, art for the sake of stirring up your sexual passions would be the official way of looking at pornography. But art illustrating the beauty of the woman and the beauty of the man as God created him, when they were naked in the garden, God says, it's all good. He used the word shalom, shalom. And you see, The prudes there said they would never let Hans Rookmacher come back to Westminster Seminary because he dared to show Greco-Roman statues or murals which had naked men and women. Now that was absurd. If you fall down and worship a piece of art, that is what it's talking about, idol worship. Is this where you guys ended up?
Yeah,
yeah,
that's pretty much it. And we agree. Yeah, it's just to a lot of people out there, any pictures is just they can't help but worship it, I guess, because
Well, if they worship it, they're nuts. I mean, never allowed in the churches I pastored that white honky Jesus, blue-eyed, blonde, that Gentile honky, never let him in my Messianic congregation. Jesus was not blonde, European, white, blue-eyed. And we can't do that. Muhammad was a white man, clearly according to the hadiths, but Jesus wasn't. And when I see a picture of Jesus, his hands on a surfboard, and he's giving the sign, hang loose, dudes, it just grieves me. One, it's bad art. And you would have to look in my book. Yes, a survival guide for Christian students in the university, where I talk all about a philosophy of art, how do you approach art, how do you judge art, the difference between the medium and the message of art. Can unbelievers do art? Is there such a thing as secular art? No, there isn't. All of life is sacred. So a painting of a bowl of apples is just as sacred as a painting of the man resting his elbows and praying before he eats the apples. But it's all balled up with Roman Catholicism and that nonsense. And Nathan wants to add something here.
Oh, I just wanted to ask, how you doing, Vincent and Matt?
doing well. How about you?
Doing good, by God's grace. Nice to see you guys again.
Nice to see you too, Nate.
Yep.
Now, you guys can probably see the influence that Dr. Bob has had on me, because you guys have talked to me for many years. And one of the things, Dr. Bob, that I've always really admired about you is something that people don't get at first. When you first started to answer the question, I'm pretty sure in people's minds, in the audience, and maybe even in these guys' minds, they're going, well, why is he talking about all that? That's not the question I asked. But what I learned, knowing Dr. Bob, is if you listen to what he does, he backs up from the question and he gives you a little background as to, he sets you up to understand something first, and then he brings you back to the question so that when he answers it, you're able to understand the answer. The problem in a lot
approach it right. A guy called me, he wanted to know about Romans 9. I said, well, before you can understand Romans 9, number one, chapter divisions are artificial, created by Robert Stephanus, and often his horse would trip and he'd make a chapter division. There's absolutely no reason. So first you must understand this is a section that incorporates 8 and 9 as a unit. So don't think because the chapter closed on 8 that 9 has nothing to do with 8. It has everything to do with it.
Right.
And then we talked about verse divisions are also arbitrary and usually wrong. Then I said, now number 2, someone gives illustrations to explain a point that they're making. Now, if you spend all your time arguing over the illustrations without getting to the point that caused them or generated them, you'll never get anywhere. It's like Luke 15, they saw Jesus with sinners, and they said, this man receiveth sinners. Well, Jesus takes off and talks about the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. All 3 parables to illustrate he receives sinners gladly. anyone who comes to Christ is received. Then along come the fundamentalists and the others, low information evangelicals, and they see, oh, look at here, the parable of the prodigal son. That has to do with the Christian who fell away. Come home. And they do. They're backslidden saints. That's the Father's God, the Father. And that, no, it isn't. Jesus is the Father in the story, and it's about receiving people for salvation. It doesn't have anything to do with backslidden people who are believers. And so he illustrated with 3 parables, very Jewish parables, the fact that he received sinners. And go back to Romans 9, and I had to explain this to him. What was the point he was illustrating? It took a hard time for him to figure that out. If you look at Romans 8 and 9 together, the point is God is free to do with us as he pleases.
Amen.
Now, he's going to illustrate this with Pharaoh and with Esau and Jacob and this and that. Now, and see, the Arminians immediately, we're going to argue whether that maybe Esau and Jacob are nations. He said that means that God can do corporately with an entire nation. He could throw them all in hell. And then they don't like that either. They compound the problem. The point is, what is Paul illustrating? Illustrations do not prove something. Illustrations only, hopefully, give you a deeper understanding of what he's trying to prove. The absolute sovereignty of God before creation. He chose us all the way through. And so the illustrations, I said, don't get hung up on his quote from Jeremiah, the potter and the clay. That's an illustration that simply says the potter from the same lump of clay can take part of it, slap it on the wheel, and make a vase for flowers. He puts that aside, grabs some more clay, throws it on the wheel, and he makes a urinal for his grandfather who can't get out of bed, and so he can pee in there. Does the potter have the right to do whatever he wants, and there can be no moral objection? Can the urinal say, why did you make me like this? I shouldn't do it. No. That's why Paul gets incensed. Who art thou, O man, that repliest against God? Shall the thing formed quibble with the Creator? So once he understood, it doesn't matter if Esau and Jacob represented nations. I believe that exegetically they didn't. But that even makes the issue greater. God can do with entire tribes and nations whatever he wants to do. Try the whole world. When only 8 people got in the boat, what did he do with the rest of humanity? Down the toilet. There was a big sucking sound as all of mankind went down the toilet. So the reason I backed up on the second commandment was to talk about 2 tablets, not 1 tablet, that gets rid of all of, is it 5 and 5 or 6 and 4? You have Michael Horton arguing whether or not it was 4 and 3. All of that is nonsense. And then you understand.
And the thing I like about that approach, and I've used it and I've learned from it and I've grown and been able to do it on my own, is that, and I remember something that you said to me a long time ago in our personal discussions and also at church too, is that most often the problem is with the question. And when you try to answer a question that is either malformed or ignorant or presupposes a false idea or something, and you just automatically try to answer it, you'll end up giving an answer that is either incomplete or not correct. You have to back up from the question, give a little background, go back to the question, make sure that the question is formulated correctly, and then answer it.
The point I learned from Gordon Clark You guys ever read anything of Gordon Clark's?
Oh, they love Van Til and Gordon Clark.
Did
Well,
you
no,
read
I read,
Revelation?
yeah, Reason, Revelation. Yeah, I read that one.
Now, that was handed to me when I was 16 years old by Walter Martin. And Gordon Clark, his book on philosophy of religion, of course, is very important. From Thales to Dewey, he surveyed the Greek philosophies. Fantastic. He was the most brilliant Christian of his generation. His IQ was off the charts. His constant harping was when you asked him a question, do you know what your question is? Where did you get it? And what are you assuming that you came up with such a question? Our questions come up as bubbles and they break the surface. He wanted to know where your question came from. So when someone asks me a question that they're assuming let's say John Dewey's faculty psychology, where man is intellect, will, and emotion in airtight containment compartments, and they don't affect each other. And they would say, well, do you believe in free will? And I said, I don't have, so I said, what you mean? You mean John Dewey's, you have a will? Yeah, I mean that you have a will. I said, I've got a will. It tells what happens when I die and what my children get. But neither in Hebrew nor Greek, in its anthropology, is there any concept like that of modern psychology where you have a will that acts apart from and independent of the rest of you. It's not there. Can't find it. So when someone is assuming modern psychological theories and they ask you a question, you can't answer it because the question's screwed up.
Right.
But you have to step back and say, now, you've asked a question. Let's think about it. So my major was linguistic analysis a la Wittgenstein. You ever guys, any of you have read Wittgenstein?
Nope.
Linguistic analysis, ever heard of it?
Tractus.
John Frame,
Yeah.
we used to get together. You know, there's 14 different meanings to the word is.
Oh, so Bill Clinton was mentions.
14 different meanings to the word is. Very famous book.
Wait, Dr. Bob, are you saying there is 14 different meanings to is? That was a joke.
Are.
Wasn't
There are.
wrong at all.
And see, this is where God's people ask questions that are the wrong questions because they're asking out of an assumption of paganism.
Yeah.
And so if you don't back up, like I did with this guy in Romans 9, and said, let's just back up. We get to chapter 8, which he never knew he could go back to. Then moving forward from chapter 8, after whom God predestined, whom he justified, these are all the eternal. God can do whatever he wants. And that was what he said to Pharaoh. I will raise up if I want to. I will put down if I want to. And when you question the God who created you, you get a slap in the face, like Uncle Corny would said, someone who questions God is like you took your child on your lap and they reached up and slapped you.
I don't know who Uncle Corny is.
Oh, I
I have to explain his pretty
But anyway, Nathan is up
That's
here.
Van Til.
Oh, yeah, that's Uncle Corny's man, too.
Okay.
And I knew him years before I got to Westminster. He sent me everything he ever wrote 3 times because he couldn't remember the hits. But I never complained because I could give the excess to others.
Van Til said about you understanding his method.
Oh, and my little book, Introduction to Defending the Faith, came out, which was generated by a conference to high school students at a camp, where I taught them the Christian Vestivi, the Weltanschauung, the Christian world and life view, and applied it to art and to history and psychology and all this stuff. But in the first section, talks about evidentialism and presuppositionalism and blah, 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 blah. He read that, And he said, you understand, I am not against evidences. Everybody keeps misunderstanding. The evidences are there, and he gave me this illustration. Now, the revolving door only works, said Van Til, because there's a pin at the top and a pin in the bottom that are inserted in a frame. Now, if you take away the frame or the context, what happens to the revolving door? It falls down on its side of absolutely no use. He said that's why logic, that's why evidences, none of it will work unless you presuppose the framework of theism, biblical theism, which I thought was a good illustration. I stole it from him many, many years ago and have used that. But Nathan, sola scriptura. So my book on natural theology, natural law, natural religion, natural apologetics, a la Craig, Bill Craig, and the others. They all run from exegesis as fast as they can. Their excuse to me when I would challenge them, well, I'm not a theologian. I don't have to use scripture. I'm a philosopher. Well, Paul took a rather dim view. In 1 Corinthians 2, he said all the philosophy of man is foolishness. It's nothing but chattering. And in Colossians, he really slams it big time. So when people decide, I'm going to believe and live according to humanistic pagan philosophy and not scripture, that's the issue. Well, guys, I don't want to interrupt anymore. I'm handing you over to Nathan. And here you go. Thanks for listening to me for a couple of minutes.